Hetta Voss had given this kingdom everything a woman can give without being asked. She had raised children who were not hers, as if they were her whole heart. She had pressed her hands into the northern earth for 40 years and felt the land answer back. On a cold morning, the man she had built a kingdom for stood before his court and dissolved her. She walked out, back straight, chin level, the amber ring in her pocket. She had nowhere to go. She went north. The map she followed led to a forest no one talked about, to a house that should have been ruins. It wasn't ruins. It was waiting. She thought she was looking for shelter. She had no idea the house had been looking for her. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories. And you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The hall smelled exactly the way it always had. Beeswax candles, pine resin from the winter fires, and underneath it all, the cold, particular scent of stone that never quite warmed no matter how many years you filled it with your living. Hetta Voss had walked into this hall as a young woman of 23, wearing her mother's amber ring and the weight of a bloodline older than the northern walls themselves. She had walked into it 1,000 times since, as a new bride, as a queen, as a mother in everything but name, raising 3 children who shared her table but not her blood, as the woman who had, quietly and without acknowledgement, been the reason every crop in the Northern Territory had flourished for 40 years. She was 63 now. Her hair was silver. Her hands, folded in her lap with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that composure was the last armor available to her, showed the marks of decades. And she was sitting in the second chair, the chair to the right of the throne, the one that was hers by 4 decades of marriage and by the ancient Northern covenant that had made her family's power the foundation of this kingdom, while her husband of 40 years stood at the front of the room and announced, in the voice he used for formal declarations, that he was taking a new mate. The candles didn't flicker. The walls didn't crack. The stone floor didn't open up and offer her the mercy of the earth. The court was very quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when everyone already knows what is about to happen and is waiting, with a mixture of relief and guilt, for it to be said aloud. Serana stood at Simon's left, 37, dark-haired, beautiful in the particular way of people who have spent years cultivating beauty as a weapon. She did not look at Hetta. That was, Hetta thought distantly, its own kind of cruelty. The decency of avoiding the eyes of the woman you're replacing required acknowledging that she was there to be replaced. Serana had not even granted her that. Simon's voice continued. Formal words. Ancient declarations. He was dissolving their bond under the provision of the Barren Queen, an old law, dusty with disuse, that allowed an Alpha King to seek a new mate if the first had produced no heirs. It didn't matter that Hetta had raised 3 of his bastard sons as her own, given them names and educations and the kind of love that costs something. It didn't matter that the reason the northern fields had been abundant for 40 years was a power that lived in her blood, not his. It didn't matter that he had become king only because she, the last of the Voss bloodline, had stood beside him at a ceremony 23 years before his own coronation and given him access to a legacy that was never his to begin with. None of that mattered in a formal declaration. What mattered was that she had never carried a child to term, that the 3 heirs standing to the right of the room, Corvin, tall and cold-eyed, Mira, not quite meeting Hetta's gaze, Rendell, looking at his boots, were Simon's children by other women, and they bore his name because Hetta had signed the papers that legitimized them, because she had loved them enough to do what was hard, and because she had believed, for 40 years, that love freely given was its own kind of power. She understood now, sitting in the second chair while the candles burned steadily, and the court held its collective breath, that she had been wrong about that. The declaration ended. Simon looked at her for the first time. His eyes were careful in the way of someone who has prepared a speech and is relieved to be done with it. Not cruel, not triumphant, just done. As if 40 years was a ledger that had been balanced and closed. "The Queen's seal and titles will be transferred," he said, still formal, still distant, "upon completion of the dissolution documentation, which meant you have nothing now. Sign where we tell you, and go." Somewhere to Hetta's right, a familiar voice said, at full volume and with absolute composure, "Well, that was the most expensive Tuesday I've ever sat through." Several people flinched. Hetta did not. She had always loved Beatrix for exactly this. Beatrix, 62 years old, gray-haired, with the bearing of a woman who had decided decades ago that other people's discomfort was not her problem, was sitting 3 seats down in the ladies' row. She had been Hetta's lady-in-waiting since they were both young enough to think the title mattered, and had long since evolved into something that had no official name but functioned as a combination of best friend, conscience, and designated speaker of things no one else would say. 40 years, Beatrix continued, in the conversational tone she used for statements she fully intended to be heard by everyone in the room. 40 harvests. 3 boys raised from infancy with your own 2 hands. And he's giving you the door and a pity shrug. She paused, looking at Corvin specifically. At least a dog gets a goodbye pat. Corvin's jaw tightened. Hetta stood up. She did not do it quickly. She did not do it shakily. She rose from the second chair the way she'd learned to rise from every difficult thing, with her back straight and her chin level and the particular calm of a woman who has already survived things that should have broken her and discovered that surviving doesn't require permission. She picked up her amber ring from her left hand and set it down on the arm of the chair, not dramatically, just placed it there, because it had been her mother's, and she would not leave it in this room. She walked down the center of the hall. 40 years of muscle memory knew these floors. The court parted. No one spoke. Even Simon said nothing, which was perhaps the loudest thing he'd ever said to her. She walked out. Behind her, she heard Beatrix stand up, the specific sound of a woman who has made a decision and is not taking questions about it. Gather her own things, and follow. Outside the hall, the corridor was cold and empty, and the sound of the ceremony behind them dulled to a low murmur. Hetta stood in the corridor for 3 full seconds, breathing, just breathing, letting the air come in and go out and carry with it the last of the 40 years that had just been folded up and handed back to her like someone else's coat. "Where are we going?" Beatrix asked beside her. Hetta looked at the corridor. At the end of it, the great doors. Beyond those doors, the courtyard, the gates, and beyond the gates, a world that had not been hers to navigate alone since she was 23 years old. "North," Hetta said. "I've always been better at north." She walked toward the doors, and Beatrix walked beside her, and the amber ring was warm in Hetta's pocket, and somewhere ahead of them was a road she had never taken, leading somewhere she could not yet name. That, she thought, was perhaps the first honest thing that had happened to her in 40 years. The northern road in late autumn was not a comfortable road. It was narrow in places, wide and exposed in others, and had been maintained over the decades with the particular inconsistency of infrastructure that everyone agrees is someone else's responsibility. The stones were uneven. The wind came down from the ridge with the cheerful malice of wind that has nothing better to do. And the cart that Beatrix had acquired, through a sequence of events she described only as a negotiation, and we don't need to revisit it, had one wheel that made a sound on every third rotation that was less a squeak and more a philosophical complaint. Hetta sat on the bench with her cloak pulled close and her amber ring warm against her fingers, and watched the Northern Territory move past her. She had governed this land for 40 years. She had walked its fields, signed the documents that kept its borders and its granaries and its systems of order in motion, and she had felt, in the specific way of people whose blood carries an old inheritance, the steady pulse of the land beneath everything, the way it breathed in spring, the way it slowed in winter, the way it had, every single year of her tenure, given back more than it took, because she had asked it to, and because it had known her name. She wondered if it knew her name still. She wondered if, now that the Northern Covenant was dissolved, and the documents were signed and Simon had taken the seal, and the title, and the chair that had been hers since she was 23, the land would notice the difference. She was fairly certain it would. "You're doing the thing," Beatrix said from her half of the bench. "What thing?" "The thing where you sit perfectly still, and your face is calm, and you look like a serene elder stateswoman, but anyone who's known you for 60 years can see you're having an extremely loud internal argument." Beatrix adjusted her cloak. "It's very dignified. It's also very exhausting to watch." "I'm thinking," Hetta said. "I know, that's the problem." Beatrix pulled out a paper-wrapped bundle from somewhere inside her coat and began eating a piece of bread with the focused satisfaction of someone who had thought ahead, while other people were being publicly divorced. "You need to stop thinking about Simon." "I'm not thinking about Simon. You're thinking about the land, which leads to Simon, which leads to 40 years, which is a circular path that ends in grief. And grief on an uncomfortable cart in the cold is a terrible combination." "Ah," she offered Hetta a piece of bread. "Eat something. Grief burns calories." Hetta took the bread. It was, she realized after the first bite, the first thing she'd eaten since yesterday's breakfast. The court had been preparing for the dissolution ceremony all morning, and she had been preparing for it in her own way, which had not involved eating. And now she was on a cart heading north with her best friend and the amber ring, and approximately 40 years of compressed emotion she had not yet had the privacy to put down. "Where exactly are we going?" Beatrix said. "Not where are we going?" That had been answered. North. But the specific, practical, where does north end version of the question? "Voss land," Hetta said. "The old territories. My grandmother's grandmother held land up there before the family consolidated south." She looked at the ridgeline. "There's a map in the estate records. I copied it when I was young, in case I ever needed it." She paused. "I was a very practical young woman." "You were a suspicious young woman," Beatrix said, with what sounded like admiration. "You copied the escape map before you even moved in. That's not practical, that's prophetic. I prefer to call it prepared. I prefer to call it what it is." Beatrix finished her bread. "What's on the old Voss land?" "I don't know exactly," Hetta said. "The map marks a structure. My grandmother called it the Hearthstone. She said it was built by the first Voss who was ever turned away from somewhere she belonged." She looked at the amber ring in her palm. Old gold, the stone warm despite the cold. Her mother had worn it. Her mother's mother. An unbroken line of women who had, each in their own time, found their way back to something. "She said the house would know us." Beatrix looked at her for a moment. "The house would know us," she repeated. "That's what she said." "Right." Beatrix tucked the bread wrapper away. "So we're navigating by a hand-copied map to a building that allegedly has opinions about its occupants. Excellent. This is a completely normal Tuesday." They stopped for the night at a way station 2 hours before the ridge, which was less a way station and more a building that had at some point decided it was a way station and had been coasting on that decision ever since. The fire was functional. The cots were not going to be discussed. A local woman named Petra sold them hot broth and told them, without being asked, that nobody went past the ridge anymore. "Why not?" Beatrix asked, with the tone of someone who fully expects the answer to be either interesting or absurd and is prepared for both. Petra considered this for a moment, warming her own hands on her cup. "Things glow," she said finally. "In the trees, up past the old Voss boundary line." She looked at them with the comfortable certainty of a woman who has made peace with her local, inexplicable phenomena. "Animals that shouldn't be there. Small ones. They don't hurt anything. But they've been there for years now, and people don't go past because it's not—" She searched for the word. "Normal. And by small ones," Hetta said carefully. "You mean what?" Petra looked at her with the particular focus of someone deciding how much to say. "Wolves," she said, "but small. Like pups except they don't grow, and they glow. Soft, like embers. Amber light mostly." She set her cup down. "My grandmother said they're called the vigilantes. Old word. Older than the kingdom. Older than most names around here." She paused. "She said there are 6 of them. Always 6. And they only come when someone from the old Voss blood is coming home." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Hetta felt something shift in her chest. something very old and very specific, like a door she had not known was closed beginning, cautiously, to open. "Thank you," she said. Petra nodded, collected the empty bowls, and left them to the fire. Beatrix looked at Hetta with the expression she reserved for moments when the world had exceeded her expectations without warning. "The vigilantes," she said. "Yes. 6 glowing wolves with a collective name and a specific activation condition, which is apparently us. Apparently. And we are, to your knowledge, the only Voss bloodline currently heading north. We are." Beatrix picked up her broth. She looked at the fire for a long, thoughtful moment, with the expression of a woman revising her entire model of what the next several days were going to involve. "When I followed you out of that hall this morning," she said finally, "I was thinking more along the lines of a quiet cottage and some overdue rest. Maybe a garden." She drank. "I want that noted." "Noted," Hetta said. "That said," a pause, "I am not curious." They crossed the ridge at mid-morning. The road past Petra's way station became less road and more suggestion. A path through the pines that was wider than a game trail, but narrower than anything that expected cart traffic. Beatrix navigated the one squeaky wheel cart through it, with the focused expression of a woman managing something and choosing not to discuss how hard. Hetta watched the trees. The forest here was old. Older than the settlement behind them, older than the Northern Kingdom in its current form, possibly older than any name that had ever been given to this particular stretch of land. The pines were enormous, their canopy filtering the light into something horizontal and pale. And underneath them, the undergrowth was dense and quiet in a way that was not the quiet of emptiness. It was the quiet of attention, as if the forest was listening. Hetta's hands were warm. She noticed this gradually, a steady warmth moving up from her palms, the kind that had nothing to do with the temperature, which was cold, and everything to do with something she hadn't felt in years. Decades, possibly. A pulse. Not her own heartbeat. Something beneath that. Something older, rising through the soles of her boots from the ground below and through the air around her palms, as if the land was recognizing her, finding her again after 40 years of access through a bond that had always been secondhand, always filtered through a covenant that had never been entirely hers to begin with. She felt the tears before she expected them. She blinked them back, not from shame, but because she was in motion, and Beatrix would notice. Beatrix noticed. "Hetta!" "I'm fine." "I know." And that was all. Beatrix was, among her many virtues, extraordinarily good at knowing when nothing else was needed. They rounded a long curve in the path and came into a clearing. The house at the center of it was, she didn't have the word for it immediately, substantial. Stone-built and old, older than anything she had any right to recognize, with a roof that was more living moss than tile, and windows that caught the pale forest light and held it the way amber holds warmth. It looked like it had grown there, as if the forest had arranged itself around it with the deliberate care of something that had decided, long ago, that this place was worth protecting. And at the threshold, arranged in a loose line with the patient posture of creatures who have been expecting someone and are satisfied to finally see them arrive, were 6 small wolves. They were the size of large cats. Their fur was dark, deep gray, shot through with silver at the edges, and each one glowed from within with a soft, steady amber light, not blazing, not flickering, simply present, the way coals glow when they have been tended and have never once gone cold. Hetta stopped the cart. The 6 wolves looked at her. Then the smallest one, compact, bright-eyed, with the alert energy of a creature who has been waiting the longest and is not bothering to hide it, stood up from the line, walked forward 3 deliberate steps, and sat back down directly in front of her. Ears up, amber eyes steady, the posture of someone making a formal introduction. "That one," Beatrix said quietly, "has done this before." Hetta climbed down from the cart. The cold air hit her face, and the warmth in her hands intensified, climbing up to her wrists, her forearms, her chest, and she walked toward the smallest wolf, slowly, the way you approach anything that has chosen to trust you and deserves to have that trust received carefully. She crouched down, The small wolf looked at her with enormous, steady eyes. "Hello," Hetta said. The wolf made a sound. Not a bark. Something between a chime and an exhale. Warm and low, like a word in a language she almost remembered. She reached out her hand, and the small wolf pressed the top of its head into her palm with the complete, unhesitating confidence of something that has been sure of this moment for a very long time. Behind her, she heard Beatrix step down from the cart and come to stand at her shoulder. Then, in a low voice that Beatrix usually only used when something had genuinely moved her, and she hadn't had time to put the dry commentary in front of it. "What are their names?" Hetta looked at the 6 wolves, one by one. The small, bold one, still pressing into her hand. She knew, without knowing how she knew, the way you know things that come from somewhere older than thought. Taryn. The one beside Taryn, slightly larger, with watchful eyes that moved slowly across the clearing before returning to Hetta. Cataloging, considering, deciding. Vina. The third, round-faced and warm, whose glow was a shade softer than the others, sitting very close to Taryn as if proximity was its preferred condition. Sorrel. The fourth, positioned slightly apart from the rest, with a stillness that was not cold but measured. The one watching Beatrix specifically, with the steady, assessing quality of a creature that reserved its trust and intended to mean it when it gave it. Grev. The fifth, the tallest of the 6, with silver more pronounced in its fur than the others, and eyes that held the particular quality of something that had seen a great deal and had long since stopped being surprised. Lorne. And the 6th, currently in the process of walking forward to investigate Beatrix and misjudging the distance between itself and a tree root, catching its own paw, overcorrecting, and sitting down in a location it had clearly not intended with an expression of complete dignity. Pen. Beatrix looked at Pen. Pen looked at Beatrix. "That one," Beatrix said, "is mine." Pen sneezed. "Perfect," said Beatrix. "We'll get along fine." Hetta stood at the threshold of the Hearthstone with Taryn at her feet, Vina and Sorrel pressing warmly against her legs, Lorne and Grev flanking the door with the serious posture of creatures who understood ceremony, and Pen navigating Beatrix's ankles with enthusiastic if imprecise loyalty. The warmth in Hetta's hands had spread to her whole body now. Not heat, not fever, but the specific sustained warmth of something recognized, something remembered. She placed her palm flat against the stone of the doorframe, and the door opened, not with a creak, not with resistance, simply opened. The way a door opens for someone who belongs on the other side of it, and always has. She had walked out of a hall that morning with nothing but an amber ring, and 63 years of composure she had refused to spend on people who didn't deserve it. She had no title, no covenant, no name attached to a throne that had been built on her bloodline and then closed to her. She had this. She stepped inside. The vigilantes followed, all 6 of them, Taryn first, Grev last, Pen sideways through the door for reasons that remained unexplained, and the warmth closed around her like something that had been waiting 40 years to be allowed back in. That, Hetta thought, as the amber glow of 6 small wolves lit the old stone walls of a house that knew her name, was the first honest welcome she had received in longer than she could cleanly remember. The Hearthstone at night was not dark. That was the first thing Hetta noticed when she woke in the small hours. Not the cold, not the unfamiliar sounds of a house settling into itself, not the absence of the soft court noises she'd fallen asleep to for 40 years. What woke her was the light. The 6 vigilantes had distributed themselves around the room with the quiet efficiency of creatures who had been doing this for a very long time. Taryn at the foot of her bed, Sorrel curled against her left side, Vina at the window with her eyes on the tree line. Their amber glow turned the old stone walls warm and gold, and the room breathed with it. Hetta lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling. The ceiling of the Hearthstone was carved. She hadn't noticed it in the dimness of the evening before. She'd been tired in the bone-deep way of people who have spent an entire day being formal under unbearable circumstances, and she had eaten the dried provisions Beatrix produced from somewhere and gone to bed without examining much of anything. But now, in the amber light of 6 small wolves, she could see it. Symbols worked into the stone, running in a continuous border around the room's edge. Not decorative. Purposeful. The kind of marks people make when they want something to last longer than they do. She sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Sorrel, who made a small sound of protest and then resettled with the philosophical acceptance of a creature accustomed to adjusting. Lorne was awake. He was standing at the far end of the room, near a door she hadn't noticed the night before. Narrow, set into the wall at the point where the carved border was densest, almost hidden by the way the shadows fell. He was looking at her with his ancient, silver-threaded eyes. Not urgently, not demanding. Simply waiting. The way very old things wait when they know you'll understand when you're ready and they're not in a hurry. All right, Hetta said quietly, to herself as much as to him. She wrapped her cloak around her shoulders, found her boots, and crossed the room. Lorne turned without haste and walked to the narrow door. It opened at his touch. Or rather, it opened at the moment Hetta's hand joined his at the frame, both of them pressing against the stone at once, and something clicked that was not a latch but felt like a recognition. Beyond it was a room the size of a large wardrobe. Stone walls, no windows, and on every surface, floor, ceiling, the 4 walls, the same carved symbols from the bedroom, but here they were complete. Here they connected. And here, when Lorne sat down in the center and his amber glow settled into the enclosed space, they did something that made Hetta's breath stop. They moved. Not quickly. Not dramatically. The way water moves when something disturbs the surface. A slow, rippling illumination spreading outward from where Lorne sat, traveling along the carved channels in the stone until the entire room glowed. And in the glow, the walls became not transparent, not a window, but present, as if the stone had absorbed something over centuries and was now, very carefully, giving it back. She saw a woman she didn't know, standing in a field with her hands in the earth. Then another, older, in different clothes, placing her palm flat against a boundary stone and feeling the land respond. Then another, and another, generation after generation, each one different, and each one the same in the most essential way. Hands in the earth, land responding. Power that moved through blood like water through old stone, finding the cracks it had always known. The Voss gift. She had known she had it, had always known, in the unexamined way of things you've simply always been. The fields of the Northern Territory had flourished under her tenure. The land had known her name. But she had never, not once in 40 years, understood where it came from, what it was called, or what it was capable of beyond what she'd already done with it. The walls showed her. The Voss gift was not agricultural. It was not, at its root, about crops or growing seasons or soil fertility, though those were what it produced when properly anchored. At its root, at the level the carved symbols described, in the language of the women who had lived in this room and worked this stone over centuries, it was about belonging, the power to recognize where a place's natural vitality was obstructed, the ability to give it back, not just land. Anything living that had been cut off from what it needed, anything severed from where it was supposed to be. Hetta sat down on the floor. She sat there for a long time. Lorne came and pressed his silver head against her knee and held it there with the steady patience of a creature that understood the weight of large realizations and knew not to rush them. The Northern Territory has been declining, she said eventually, to the walls and to Lorne and to the carved lines of women she would never meet. 2 years, since the covenant was dissolved. The walls didn't answer. They didn't need to. She put her hand flat on the floor of the room, and the stone pulsed back, warm, immediate. The land beneath speaking the way it had been trying to speak to her all day, and she'd only half been listening. It was not dying. Not yet. But it was. Separated. Confused. Like a thing that had been pointed in one direction for 40 years, and was now trying to find its footing with the compass gone. She was the compass. She had always been the compass. And Simon had taken the land's covenant and signed it to his own name, and the land did not know his name the way it knew hers. And in 2 more years, it would show in the harvests, and in 5, it would show in the fields, and in 10, the Northern Territory would look exactly the way it had looked before her grandmother's grandmother had first put her hands in the earth here. She breathed. "Well," she said, to no one in particular. Lorne looked up at her. "He took the throne," she said. "He didn't take the gift." She looked at her hands. "He can't, actually. It doesn't transfer on a document." She paused, and something that had been hollow in her chest for the past 24 hours filled in. Not with anger, which would have been easier, but with something cooler and more useful. Clarity. He has no idea what's about to happen to his harvest. Lorne made the low chiming sound. "I know," she said. "That's not why I'm going to fix it." She stood up carefully, her knees reminding her that 63 was a number with physical opinions. "I'm going to fix it because it's mine. The land is mine. It's always been mine." She looked at the walls, the long line of women in the stone, hands in the earth, each one turning away from something that had failed them and toward the thing that hadn't. And because someone has to. She walked back to bed, and Sorrel resettled against her without comment, and Taryn watched the door with the steady glow of something keeping a promise, and Hetta slept better than she had in 40 years. She did not tell Beatrix about the room immediately, not because she was keeping it. She kept nothing from Beatrix as a policy, because Beatrix found out anyway and was insufferable about it when she had to work for information, but because the morning was occupied. Penn had found the kitchen. This was, on its own, not alarming. Penn finding things was something the vigilantes had apparently accepted as a fixed condition of Penn's existence. What was alarming was that Penn had found the kitchen, investigated the kitchen, become excited about something in the kitchen, and in the process of becoming excited, had knocked over the single clay pitcher that had been balanced on the edge of the counter, which had knocked over a dried herb bundle, which had knocked over a stack of old wooden plates, which had produced a sound like a small avalanche and brought Beatrix out of her room at speed with an expression that was 40% alarm, and 60% resigned familiarity with chaos. Penn sat in the center of the kitchen floor, surrounded by the archaeology of its own enthusiasm, with the expression of a creature that knew it was responsible for this and was working out how to look like it wasn't. "Penn," Beatrix said, in the tone of a woman beginning a relationship that she already knows is going to require a great deal of patience. Penn sneezed. "Right," said Beatrix. "We're going to establish some ground rules." Penn's ears went sideways in a way that suggested deep interest in the concept of ground rules, and no particular commitment to following them. By mid-morning, the kitchen was restored. Penn had been diplomatically redirected toward the outdoors, where enthusiasm could expand in more directions, and Hetta and Beatrix sat at the long stone table with tea that Beatrix had produced from her apparently bottomless travel pack, and Hetta told her about the room. Beatrix listened without interrupting, which was, for Beatrix, a significant act of restraint. When Hetta finished, Beatrix was quiet for a moment. She turned her cup in her hands. Outside, through the low window, they could see Penn chasing something in the clearing with Sorrel following at a calm trot, and Taryn watching both of them from a tree stump with the expression of a middle manager monitoring a situation. "So," Beatrix said finally, "the land is yours. The gift is yours." He got the title and the throne and a woman 30 years younger, and the complete absence of any idea what he actually needed to keep that territory alive. "In essence," Hetta said, "and the harvests are going to start failing. In approximately 2 years, if I had to estimate." Beatrix nodded slowly. "And you're going to fix it. From here, on my own terms." Hetta looked out the window. The clearing was golden in the late autumn light, and the vigilante's glow added to it something warmer still. "He doesn't get the gift just because he took the covenant. The land doesn't work that way. He'll figure that out eventually. And when he does," Beatrix said, "he'll come looking for you." "He will," Hetta agreed. "And when he comes looking for you," Beatrix continued, with the careful tone of someone walking through a sequence to its logical conclusion, "you will be here. In a house he doesn't know exists. with 6 glowing wolves that answer to your bloodline, and 40 years of patience that I personally watched you develop. She looked at Hetta. I'm saying you have a stronger position than you think. I know, Hetta said. I'm saying the woman who copied the escape map before she moved in might have been all along playing a longer game than anyone gave her credit for. Beatrix. I'm just noting it, Beatrix said, and drank her tea. For posterity. From outside, Pen made a sound of pure triumph. Then the sound of something falling. Then silence. Found another hole? Sorrel's glow seemed to say, pulsing once from the direction of the clearing. Naturally, said Beatrix. He arrived on the 3rd day, when Hetta was on her knees in the frozen kitchen garden talking to it. She was not, to be clear, talking to the garden out loud. She was communicating with it in the way she'd always communicated with land. Palms flat, eyes closed, listening for the pulse beneath the surface, and following it down to find where the obstruction was. The kitchen garden of the Hearthstone had been untended for years. The soil was compacted and cold, and had the sullen, withdrawn quality of growing things that had given up being asked for anything. She'd been at it for an hour, slowly, carefully, doing less commanding than conversing, asking rather than directing. What do you need? What's blocked? The way you talk to something you've hurt by accident and want to help, if it'll let you. The vigilantes were arranged around her in a loose arc, Vina and Grev on either side, Taryn slightly ahead, Sorrel against her left knee, Lorne sitting back at a watchful distance. Pen was investigating a corner of the garden wall with the dedicated focus of a creature who had found a smell and was committed to determining its origin. The warmth had been building in Hetta's hands for 20 minutes, moving down through the soil in careful increments, when Pen's head came up, then Grev's, then Vina's, then, in sequence, all 6 of the vigilantes turned to look at the same point in the trees at the clearing's edge. Hetta opened her eyes. The man at the tree line was perhaps 65, possibly a year or 2 more, the kind of age that settled into a person's face with the specific quality of someone who had lived their years forward, rather than managing them from a distance. He was tall in the way of people who'd been tall their whole lives and had stopped thinking about it. Gray at the temples, darker where the gray hadn't reached. A cloak that had seen significant use. And an expression of genuine, complete surprise that seemed entirely unperformed. He had a horse behind him. The horse was also surprised, in the equine way, ears forward, eyes wide, but with the resigned air of an animal that had been surprised by its owner before and had developed a policy of wait and see. The man looked at Hetta. He looked at the 6 glowing wolves arranged around her. He looked back at Hetta. I'm lost, he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, the voice of someone accustomed to the outdoors. I've been lost for approximately 2 hours, which I would normally consider a personal failure, but in my defense, these woods don't appear on any map I've seen. They don't, Hetta agreed, from her position on her knees in the frozen garden. She did not stand up immediately, because she was in the middle of something, and also because 63-year-old knees had opinions about abrupt standing that she had learned to respect. They were removed from the official maps about 200 years ago. The man considered this. That explains the 2 hours, he said, with the tone of someone finding consolation where available. From the doorway behind Hetta, Beatrix appeared, cup of tea in hand, arrived with the perfect timing of a woman who operated on an internal alert system tuned to the frequency of something interesting is happening. She looked at the man. She looked at his horse. She looked at Hetta on her knees in the garden, and then back at the man. Are you dangerous? She asked, with the conversational directness she applied to all essential questions. The man seemed to find this reasonable. No, he said. Genuinely lost. And at this point, somewhat hungry. Said Beatrix, which in her vocabulary meant she was withholding judgment while updating her assessment. She looked at the vigilantes. Grev was still watching the man with the reserved, careful attention he gave everything that hadn't yet earned a different response. Taryn, however, had sat down. Not toward the man, but no longer on alert. Vina had turned back to Hetta. Beatrix had learned, in 3 days, to read the vigilantes the way sailors read weather. Come in, then, she she said, and went back inside. His name was Calder Mour. He held land to the northwest. Old family land, he said, that had been in his line for 3 generations, though the line had thinned considerably over the years. He was a widower of 7 years. He had been riding the northern boundary of his property when his sense of direction had, apparently, entered a disagreement with the actual direction and lost. He ate the bread Beatrix put in front of him with the uncomplicated gratitude of someone who had been outside in the cold for too long and was not going to be formal about food. The vigilantes had followed them inside. Penn had immediately begun investigating Calder's bootlaces with the thoroughness of a customs inspector. Calder looked down at this, considered it, and apparently decided it was not a situation that required intervention. "That one's Penn," Hetta said, watching him. "Penn," Calder repeated. He looked at the others. "And the rest?" She named them. He listened with the full attention of someone who understood that names were important and was not going to treat them as decorative. "The vigilantes," he said, when she'd finished. "I've heard the name." He looked at her with the direct quality of someone asking a real question. "You're Voss blood?" "Yes." "Then you're the one they've been waiting for." He said it simply, without ceremony, the way he seemed to say most things. "The older families in this part of the north have stories about them. 6 wolves that appear when the bloodline comes home. My grandmother mentioned them once." He paused. "She said when the vigilantes glow bright, the land's about to come back to itself." Hetta looked at her hands, still faintly warm from the morning's work in the garden. "I'm beginning to understand what that means," she said. Calder nodded and didn't ask for more than she'd offered, and that was, she noticed, in the way you notice things you haven't felt in a long time. A particular kind of consideration she'd forgotten existed. From her corner, Beatrix was watching this exchange with the stillness of a woman archiving information she intends to revisit later. He stayed for the afternoon, because the northern forest in late autumn closes its light early, and Beatrix was not going to send a man out into unmapped woods in the dark, regardless of how much hospitality protocol she had technically left behind at the southern court. He helped Hetta finish the kitchen garden, not talking much, just doing the work beside her with the ease of someone who had spent enough years outdoors to understand that some things are communicated better through the hands than through conversation. At one point, Grev crossed the garden and sat down a foot from where Calder was working. Just sat there, watching. Calder looked at him. Grev looked back with his measured, reserved eyes. "He's deciding," Hetta said from where she was working 3 feet away. "About me. About whether you're worth the effort of trusting," she said. "He reserves it carefully. When he gives it, he means it." Calder looked at Grev for a moment. "That seems reasonable," he said, and went back to the work. Grev's glow shifted, very slightly, very briefly, to something a shade warmer. Hetta noticed. She said nothing, but she noticed. He left at the edge of dusk, the northern light going thin and silver above the tree line. He knew his way out. She'd shown him the path, and he stood at the edge of the clearing for a moment before mounting, and looked back at the Hearthstone with its amber-lit windows and the 6 small glowing wolves visible through the glass. "I have land to the northwest," he said, 20 minutes ride in daylight. "I know the north well." He paused, and there was a careful quality to his next words. Not tentative exactly, but precise. The care of someone who has had enough years to know the difference between offering something and pressing it. "If you need anything, supplies, information about the territory, someone who knows which paths are navigable in winter." He looked at her. "You're welcome to ask." "Thank you," Hetta said, and meant it without qualification. He nodded, mounted, and rode into the trees. She stood in the clearing until the sound of his horse faded, and the pines closed back around the silence, and Taryn came to press against her ankle in the particular way he had when he thought she'd been standing still too long. She looked down at him. "I know," she said. She went inside. Beatrix was at the table. She had her cup of tea and the expression of a woman who had prepared a comment and was deciding how long to let the silence hold before deploying it. The silence held for approximately 8 seconds. 65, Beatrix said. "Widower, knows the land, didn't ask a single unnecessary question. Left without overstaying. She drank her tea, and Grev moved closer. Beatrix, I'm observing. You're narrating. I'm observing out loud, Beatrix corrected. There's a distinction. She set her cup down. Penn also tried to steal his bootlace, and he didn't even flinch. That's not a character assessment. Hetta. The man sat in an unfamiliar house, surrounded by 6 glowing supernatural wolves, one of which attempted theft, and his response was to ask their names and help with the garden. She folded her hands on the table. I'm just saying, that's a specific kind of person. Outside, Penn had found something new to fall into. The thud was distant and muffled. Go to sleep, Beatrix, Hetta said. Going, said Beatrix. She stood, collected her cup, and paused at the doorway. I liked him, she said simply, without the dry commentary wrapped around it. Then she was gone. Hetta sat with the last of the fire, and Taryn warm at her feet, and Lorne at the window watching the dark tree line. And she thought about 40 years of a particular kind of loneliness that had been so familiar for so long, she'd stopped calling it by its name. And she thought about a man who had asked the names of 6 small wolves and listened like they mattered. And she thought that 63 was, perhaps, not the end of anything, just a different beginning, starting here, in a house that knew her name, on land that was already warming under her hands. Corvin arrived on a gray morning, 9 days after Hetta had walked out of the hall. She heard the horse before she saw him, a single rider, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had been searching for a while and was not entirely sure what they would find at the end of the search. The vigilantes heard it before she did. Vina was at the window first, then Grev, both of them still and watchful. Taryn moved to the center of the room and stayed there, not aggressive, not retreating, simply positioned, the way a person stands when they want to be seen clearly. Hetta set down the document she'd been reading. Old Voss land records, which Lorne had led her to on the 4th day, packed in a cedar chest under the floor of the back room, and looked at Taryn. Who is it? She said. Taryn's glow did not change, but something in his posture shifted, the specific quality of a creature that recognized something complicated and was reserving judgment. She went to the window. Corvin, her eldest. Not hers. She had never let herself forget that, had never wanted to, because the distinction mattered, and pretending otherwise would have been a disservice to everyone, including him. But the boy she had pulled through 3 winters of fever before he turned 10. The one she'd taught to read using the estate maps because he'd refused to sit still for anything else. The one who had, at 17, looked at her across a formal dinner table with his father's cold eyes and said, in front of guests, "You're not my real mother," and she had said quietly, "No, I'm not." And the dinner had continued, and she had never brought it up again, and neither had he. He was 34 now. He looked like his father in the architecture of his face, and like no one she knew in the particular way he carried whatever he was feeling, close to the chest, armored, the expression of a person who had learned early that showing things was dangerous. He rode into the clearing and stopped. He looked at the hearthstone, the moss-covered roof, the amber-lit windows, the stone that looked as though it had grown from the forest floor. He looked at the clearing itself, which was noticeably warmer than the surrounding woods, noticeably greener for late autumn, as though the land around the house had been having a quiet conversation with itself and had recently reached some encouraging conclusions. Then he looked at the 6 small glowing wolves arranged at the tree line, watching him with 6 different expressions ranging from reserved to actively skeptical. Then he looked at Hetta, standing at the window. Something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Not guilt, exactly. Not quite. She went to the door. "You're not easy to find," he said when she opened it. "I know," she said. That was intentional. He looked at her for a moment. He had his father's habit of using silence as assessment, measuring, calculating, deciding what position to take before committing. She had watched him do it his entire life. She knew the timing of it by now. "May I come in?" he said. And the fact that he asked, rather than simply coming in, the way Corvin had entered most rooms for most of his adult life, with the assumption of entitlement that came from being the eldest son of a king, told her something. "Yes," she said, and stepped aside. He came in with the careful movement of someone entering territory they're uncertain of, and his eyes moved across the room, the cedar records on the table, the carved walls, the warmth of the place, the fire that had been burning steadily since Hetta arrived, as if the Hearthstone had simply been waiting for someone to need it. Then his gaze landed on Penn, who was sitting in the center of the rug with an air of supreme ownership, and who looked back at Corvin with the expression of a border official waiting for documentation. "What is that?" Corvin said. "Penn," said Beatrix from the kitchen doorway, with a cup of tea and the expression she wore when she had already formed an opinion and was deciding how long to hold it back. "Would you like tea, Corvin? I'm asking as a courtesy. Whether you deserve it is a separate conversation." Corvin looked at Beatrix. "Hello, Beatrix." That wasn't a yes or a no. "Yes," he said after a beat. "Please." Beatrix went back into the kitchen. The please had been noted. They sat at the long table, Hetta across from Corvin, Taryn at Hetta's feet, Grev at a deliberate distance from Corvin with his measuring eyes, and Penn investigating Corvin's boot with the thoroughness that Penn applied to all new arrivals regardless of their significance. Corvin looked at Penn a second time. Then, with the slight adjustment of someone deciding not to fight what they can't change, he simply allowed it. Hetta waited. Corvin turned his cup in his hands. His father's gesture she'd always known, and she'd never said so. "The eastern field missed its second harvest," he said. "I know," she said. "The orchards in the valley didn't yield. The herd animals are thin despite adequate feed." He looked up at her. "Father thinks it's a seasonal variation." "It isn't," she said. "I know it isn't." His voice was quiet in a way that cost him something. "I've spent 9 days in the estate records. I found the original covenant documentation. The Voss Accord." He paused. "You were the land's anchor. Not him. You were always the anchor, and when the accord transferred, the land lost its compass," Hetta said. "Yes." The fire crackled. Penn had completed his investigation of Corvin's boot and had relocated to a position beside Grev, which was, Hetta noted carefully, slightly closer to Corvin than Grev had been before. "Corvin," she said, and his name in her mouth still had the weight of decades whether she intended it to or not. "Why did you come?" "Not for the land. You could have sent a formal request, an emissary." She looked at him steadily. "Why you?" He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that was doing work. "Because I was there," he said finally. "In the hall. I stood in that room and I watched him do it, and He stopped. He looked at the table. When he looked up again, the armor was still there, but something behind it had shifted. I didn't stop it. I could have spoken. I had standing enough to question the proceedings. I chose not to. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was more than the silence in the hall had been. "Why didn't you?" she said, not accusing. Asking. "Because Rendell was right," he said, and the words seemed to cost him more than he'd expected. He said afterward, "Rendell said that we'd spent our whole lives choosing him over you. Every time there was a choice to make, we chose the one who shared our blood over the one who chose us." He looked at her hands on the table, the hands that had signed his legitimacy papers, that had braided Mira's hair and talked Rendell through his first heartbreak at 15. "And he said we were going to lose the harvest because of it. Not as punishment. Just consequence. Because some things don't pretend to be other than they are." Beatrix came back from the kitchen with tea and set it in front of Corvin without comment. As she passed behind him, she put one hand briefly on his shoulder. A touch so quick it could have been accidental, and was anything but. Corvin looked down at his cup. "What do you need from me?" Hetta said. He looked up. "Nothing you aren't willing to give." She looked at him for a long moment. 34 years of a complicated love, the kind that isn't clean or simple, the kind that gets built in the specific conditions of people who didn't choose each other and found their way to something anyway. It wasn't the love of blood. It was something harder won and therefore, in its own way, more durable. "I'm going to continue working from here," she said, "on my own terms, from land that's mine." She kept her voice even and her eyes on his. "I won't be returning to the court. I won't be returning to that hall or that chair or any version of the arrangement your father dissolved. She paused. But the land is another matter. The land never belonged to him. It doesn't know how to. Corvin nodded, slowly. Can you help it? He said. I already am, she said. But it will go faster if I understand the specific points of obstruction. She looked at the cedar records on the table. Which means I need information about the territory's current condition. Accurate information, not what your father wants to believe. Corvin looked at her steadily. I can get that. I know you can, she said. The question is whether you will. A pause. Long enough to mean something. Yes, he said. I will. From across the room, Grev stood up. He walked, deliberately, unhurriedly, across the floor and sat down beside Corvin's chair. Not against his leg, not demanding contact. Just near. Present. Available, if Corvin chose it. Corvin looked down at the small silver-threaded wolf. He reached down slowly, uncertain, and placed his hand gently on Grev's back. Grev's glow shifted to something warmer. Hetta said nothing, but she felt something ease in her chest that had been held carefully since the hall, the specific tension of someone protecting themselves from hope. It didn't vanish. It just loosened, slightly, the way things loosen when they've been tested and haven't broken. Stay for dinner, she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a command. Beatrix made enough for 3, and Pen has been waiting to steal something from a new person since yesterday. Pen sneezed in the corner, as if confirming the agenda. Corvin looked at Pen, then at Hetta, and something in his face moved. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the shape that comes before one. The shape of someone deciding it might be allowed. All right, he said. The first time Hetta tried to fully reconnect to the Northern Territory from the Hearthstone, nothing happened. Not dramatically. Not a refusal or a resistance. Nothing that announced itself as failure. It was quieter than that. She was in the back room, the one with the carved walls, sitting in the amber light of the vigilantes arranged around her, both hands flat on the floor, eyes closed, doing the slow, patient work of extending her awareness outward through the earth. She had been doing it in small increments since she arrived. The kitchen garden, the clearing, the path between the Hearthstone and the northern tree line. Each one had responded, tentative at first, then with increasing warmth, like a conversation picking up after a long pause. But the Northern Territory proper, the fields and orchards and valley floors that had been hers for 40 years, that she could feel the edge of but not reach. A border, not the geographic border. Something older. Something that lived in the covenant structure, in the way the land had been formally bound to Simon's name, and the connection between her blood and its pulse was interrupted at exactly the point where the document had been signed. She sat with this for a long time. Lorne was beside her. He was always beside her in this room. She'd begun to understand that Lorne was the vigilante who carried the oldest memory, the one who had been awake the longest, who had watched the most cycles of the Voss line coming and going from this land. His glow was different in this room, steadier, deeper, as though the carved walls and his own light were the same system. "Show me," she said. The walls moved. What she saw this time was not the line of Voss women. What she saw was a single image, one she hadn't been shown before, of a woman sitting exactly where Hetta sat now, in the same room, in the same position, with her hands flat on the same floor. And beside the woman was a man Hetta didn't recognize, his hand over hers. Not directing her, not claiming anything, simply there. A second point of contact with the stone. A second presence, grounding the circuit. The image held for a moment, then dissolved. Hetta looked at Lorne. Lorne looked back with his ancient, patient eyes. "The Voss gift is mine," she said slowly. "But the land covenant is a bond, not a gift. It needs 2 points." She felt the shape of it settling into understanding. It broke when Simon signed it to himself because he only has one side of what the bond requires. He has the authority. I have the blood. She looked at her hands. Without both, the circuit doesn't close. Lorne made the low chiming sound. "I need a witness," she said. "Not a legal one. A living one. Someone the land recognizes as... She paused, finding the word. As present. As belonging here. She thought of Corvin, who had left the evening before with Cedar record transcriptions and a new, careful way of looking at her that she recognized as the beginning of something still being decided. She thought of Calder Mour, 20 minutes to the northwest, who had known the old names and asked the right questions, and let Grev come to him on Grev's terms. She thought of Beatrix, who had followed her out of the hall without being asked, and had not once, in 9 days, suggested they go back. She went to find Beatrix. Beatrix was in the clearing, engaged in what appeared to be a negotiation with Pen about the structural integrity of her left boot. "Pen," she was saying, with the patience of a woman in the last stage before she stopped being patient, "that is not a chew toy. That is Italian leather from a cobbler I paid a considerable amount of money, and if you... Pen. Pen had the lace. Drop it." Pen looked at the lace, looked at Beatrix, looked at the lace again with the expression of someone weighing their options against the known consequences. "I will stop giving you the good cheese," Beatrix said. Pen dropped the lace immediately. "Thank you," said Beatrix, and then to Hetta, without turning around. "I know that expression. What did you find in the room?" Hetta told her. Beatrix listened. She retrieved her bootlace, examined it for damage, decided it was acceptably intact, and was quiet for a moment while the morning moved around them, and Pen sat at her feet with the expression of a creature who had made a sacrifice and expected acknowledgement. "You need a second presence," Beatrix said, to close the circuit. "Yes, someone the land recognizes, someone who belongs to this land willingly, not by covenant or document, just by being here." Hetta looked at the clearing, at the warmth of it, the green of it, the way it had responded to her in the days since she'd arrived with an eagerness that felt less like power and more like relief. Someone who chose to stay. Beatrix looked at her for a long moment with the expression she used when she already knew the answer and was deciding how to say it without making it about herself. "Well," she said, "I didn't follow you out of that hall to stand in a clearing in the cold and not be useful." She looked at Pen, who had returned to her bootlace with renewed interest. "Pen, I see you." Pen withdrew. "Right," said Beatrix. "Lead the way." They sat in the back room together, Hetta and Beatrix, side by side, both pairs of hands flat on the floor, all 6 vigilantes arranged around them in a circle that completed itself the moment both women were seated, as if the room had been waiting for exactly this configuration for a very long time. "What do I do?" Beatrix said, in a quieter voice than she usually used. "Nothing specific," Hetta said. "Just be here. Be willing to be here." "I've been willing to be here since Tuesday," Beatrix said. "If that wasn't enough to qualify, I have concerns about the entry requirements." "It's enough," Hetta said. She closed her eyes. The warmth started in her palms, familiar now, the feeling of the land waking up beneath her contact. But this time when she reached the edge of the Northern Territory, when she felt the border where the Covenant obstruction had stopped her before, it didn't stop her. It thinned. Not because she was stronger, because Beatrix's hand was warm beside hers on the stone, and Beatrix had spent 9 days choosing this land by staying on it. And the land, which was not a document and did not care about documents, recognized the difference between someone who had signed a piece of paper and someone who had slept under the Hearthstone's roof and argued with Pen and helped mend the kitchen garden and made tea every morning in the old stone kitchen, like it was a thing she intended to keep doing. Hetta followed the warmth outward. She felt the orchards first, dormant, withdrawn, but not dead. Waiting. The way seeds wait. She moved through them carefully, finding the channels of vitality that had been rerouted and uncertain since the accord dissolved, and she began, slowly, with the patience she'd spent 40 years developing, to reorient them, not forcing, asking. Here, this direction, the one that was always yours. Beside her, Beatrix made a small sound. "I can feel that," Beatrix said, in an odd, slightly offended tone, as though she resented being moved by something supernatural on principle, but couldn't manage it in practice. "I can actually feel that." "I know," Hetta said. and kept working. They were in the room for 2 hours. When it was done, when Hetta opened her eyes and the carved walls had gone still, and the warmth had settled into a steady, sustainable hum, rather than the strained, searching pulse of before, she felt tired in the clean way of work completed, rather than the hollow way of being spent. The difference, she understood now, was the anchor, the second point of contact, the circuit closing properly instead of bleeding open. Beatrix sat beside her, looking at her hands with the expression of a woman reconsidering several things simultaneously. "The fields," Hetta said. "Will they come back?" Beatrix asked. "By spring," Hetta said. "The orchards first, then the valley floors." She looked at the walls, the carved lines of women who had done this before her, each one finding her way back after being turned away from somewhere she thought was hers. It won't happen the way it happened before. Nothing does the second time. She looked at her hands. But it'll be real, the land's own, not a performance for a king who never understood what he was standing on. Beatrix was quiet for a moment. 63 years old, she said softly. "And you are finally working for yourself." She looked at Hetta with eyes that were, very briefly, exactly what they were without the dry commentary in front of them. "It's about time." Hetta looked at her best friend, 62 years of her, gray-haired and sharp-tongued and unshakably, entirely there, and felt the fullness of it, all of it, the loss and the arrival and the work and the mourning and the warmth in her hands and pen attempting to steal something from a boot in the room above their heads. "Yes," she said. "It is." Pen sneezed upstairs. Something fell. "I'm not getting up yet," Beatrix announced. "Neither am I," said Hetta. The vigilantes glowed on around them, steady and warm and entirely unbothered, and the land outside the Hearthstone's walls breathed in the long, slow, satisfied way of something that had finally, after a very long interruption, remembered what it was supposed to do. The emissary arrived on a white horse, which Beatrix said immediately told you everything you needed to know about him. "White horses," she explained to Pen, who was listening with the focused attention he gave all of Beatrix's commentary, "are chosen by people who want to be seen arriving. A practical man rides a brown horse. A man who needs to make an impression rides white." She watched the rider pick his careful way through the clearing's edge. "That horse has been brushed this morning. He planned this." Pen sneezed in what Hetta had come to recognize as agreement. The emissary was young, perhaps 25, with the polished, careful bearing of someone who had been selected for his ability to deliver difficult messages without flinching. His name, he announced at the door, was Simon's second secretary, and he carried formal correspondence from the Alpha King of the Northern Territory. He said Alpha King of the Northern Territory with the particular emphasis of someone who had been instructed to say it exactly that way and understood why. Hetta looked at him for a moment. He was trying not to look at the 6 glowing wolves arranged in a loose arc behind her, and the effort was costing him. "Come in," she said. "Taryn, let him through." Taryn stepped aside with the deliberate, unhurried dignity of someone making a choice rather than being moved. The emissary came in. The letter was precisely what she'd expected. Formal language, precise phrasing, the kind of document that had been reviewed by 3 people before it was sealed. It acknowledged that Hetta retained certain traditional claims to Voss ancestral land, a concession that had clearly been painful to include, and then proceeded to what it actually wanted, which was for her to return to the court in an advisory capacity to assist with what the letter carefully called an agricultural consultation regarding the territory's current seasonal challenges. Beatrix read it over her shoulder and said, "He's calling the harvest failure a seasonal challenge. That's impressive. That takes a specific kind of commitment to a preferred reality." The emissary was sitting at the table with tea he hadn't touched, monitoring the vigilantes with the careful peripheral awareness of someone who had been told about them and had not fully believed it until now. Sorrel had settled on the bench beside him with the gentle, warm proximity she offered everyone eventually, not demanding, simply present. The emissary was pretending not to notice Sorrel, which was something like pretending not to notice sunlight. "Tell me," Hetta said, setting the letter down. What exactly is the current condition of the Eastern Valley? The emissary looked at her. The letter addresses what the king would like me to think the condition is, Hetta said pleasantly. I'm asking what you saw on your way here. A pause. The young man was calculating. She could see him doing it, measuring the distance between his instructions and his own direct knowledge. The Eastern Valley didn't yield, he said finally. The southern orchards have bare branches at the end of the growing season. The livestock are producing at approximately half the expected rate. He stopped. The head of the Agricultural Council told the king 2 weeks ago that it wasn't seasonal. The king disagreed. And sent you here, Hetta said. Yes. With a letter that calls it seasonal. Yes, he said, and had the decency to sound mildly embarrassed about it. Beatrix made a sound from the kitchen doorway that contained an entire editorial position without using a single word. Hetta folded the letter and set it aside. She looked at the emissary with the steady, unhurried attention she'd given every difficult conversation of her adult life. The ones that mattered. The ones where the person on the other side needed to understand that she was not angry, not desperate, not negotiating from a position of need. Simply clear. I am not returning to court, she said. I will not be returning to an advisory role, a formal capacity, an informal capacity, or any other arrangement that requires me to operate in a structure your king controls. She kept her voice even. What I will do is what I have already been doing, working from this land on these terms, in a manner I determine. She paused. The territory's fields will recover. The orchards will yield by late spring. The land knows what it's doing. It simply needed to be reoriented. I have done that. The process will continue on its own timeline, which is not subject to a king's scheduling preferences. The emissary looked at her. Something in his expression had shifted from the careful blankness of official duty to something more unguarded. The look of a young man recalibrating. He's not going to like that answer, he said. No, Hetta agreed. But it is the answer. She looked at the untouched tea in front of him. Drink your tea. It's cold by now, and that's a shame, because Beatrix makes excellent tea, and you've ridden a long way. The emissary looked at his cup. Then he drank it. Sorrel leaned against his arm. He looked down at her. Her amber glow lit the side of his face warm. She likes you, Hetta said. Sorrel is generous with that. But she's not wrong about people. The young man looked at the small, glowing wolf beside him with an expression that was trying to be professionally neutral and was not quite succeeding. What are they? He asked quietly, as if he'd been holding the question since he arrived and could no longer keep it in. The vigilantes, Hetta said. Old as the Voss land. Older than the Covenant. She looked at Taryn, who was watching the door with his quiet, dedicated attention. They appear when the bloodline comes home, and they stay. Has the bloodline, he started. It has now, she said. He left in the early afternoon with Sorrel at the door watching him go and a written response from Hetta that was 3 sentences long, clearly phrased, and contained no ambiguity whatsoever. She had written it herself, in the hand she'd used for 40 years of court documents, and it felt different this time. Not the hand of a queen signing within a structure she'd been given, but the hand of a woman writing from a place that was entirely hers. Beatrix stood beside her at the door as the white horse disappeared through the tree line. He'll send someone else, Beatrix said. Someone more senior. Then probably someone more insistent. I know, Hetta said. And when he runs out of emissaries, he'll come himself. I know that too. And when he comes himself... Beatrix. Hetta looked at her friend. I'll handle it when it arrives. Right now, I'd like to have dinner and hear what Penn has destroyed today. From somewhere inside the house there was a crash, then silence. Then Penn appeared in the doorway with an expression of complete innocence and a piece of dried herb bundle attached to his ear. Oh, Penn, Beatrix said in the tone of a woman who had given up and was at peace with it. What did you do? Penn blinked. Right, said Beatrix, and went inside. That evening, after dinner, when the fire had gone low and the vigilantes were settled in their various configurations around the room, and Beatrix had taken her tea to bed with the satisfied air of a woman whose day had contained sufficient drama for her purposes, Hetta sat alone at the long table with the land records and the amber ring warm in her palm. She thought about Corvin, who had sent a message that morning through a trusted writer. Detailed notes on the territory's condition, thorough and honest, in a way that had cost him something. She thought about the orchards she'd felt that morning in the back room, already beginning, faintly, tentatively, to remember the direction of growth. She thought about Calder Mour, 20 minutes to the northwest, who had come by 2 days ago with a wheel of hard cheese and information about the northern boundary conditions she'd asked him for, and had stayed for 2 hours, and had left without overstaying, and had looked at her when he left with the specific quality of a person who is not finished with a conversation, but understands it has its own timeline. She thought about 63 years and the particular texture of a life lived fully in service of something that had not served her back, and the surprising, specific quality of being 63 years old and finding out there were still things ahead of her she hadn't seen yet. Taryn came and put his chin on her knee. She put her hand on his head. "I know," she said. "I know." The Hearthstone settled around her, warm and old and entirely unhurried, and the land outside its walls breathed in the long, slow rhythm of something healing on its own terms. Simon came on a cold morning 3 weeks after the emissary, with 4 guards and the expression of a man who had convinced himself this was a practical visit. Hetta knew he was coming before she heard the horses. Taryn had been at the window since first light, not anxious, but watchful in the particular way he was watchful when something significant was approaching. Vina positioned herself at the door. Grev moved to the center of the room and stayed there. Even Pen was still, sitting near Beatrix's chair with the uncharacteristic gravity of a creature that understood, in whatever way the vigilantes understood things, that this was not a morning for his usual activities. Beatrix set down her tea. "He actually came," she said, in the tone of someone whose prediction had been confirmed, but who took no pleasure in it. "He always does," Hetta said. "Men like Simon cannot tolerate a situation they haven't closed. And you?" Hetta looked at the door. "I've spent 40 years managing situations men like Simon didn't close properly." She stood up, smoothed her dress, a practical dress, good fabric, nothing performative, and said, "Let him knock." He knocked. She let a reasonable pause elapse before she opened it. Simon in the clearing of the Hearthstone was. She noticed this with the detached clarity that came from no longer needing anything from him. Smaller than she remembered. Not physically. He was still a large man, still carried himself with the authority of someone who'd spent decades being the most significant person in any room. But something about the Hearthstone's clearing, the warmth of it, the age of it, the amber light of 6 vigilantes visible through the windows, made the things he'd always worn as size. Title, position, the borrowed power of a covenant he'd never truly earned, look like what they were, borrowed. He looked at the house, at the clearing, at the green of it, improbable in late autumn. His jaw tightened very slightly. She knew that jaw, knew every movement it made, in the way of someone encountering evidence that contradicts their preferred account of a situation. Then he looked at her. She waited. "Hetta," he said. "Simon," she said. No titles. She had noticed she'd done that, and she had not corrected it. "I need to speak with you," he said. "I assumed," she said. "Come in." His guards waited outside. The Hearthstone's door was wide enough for one person at a time, and the vigilantes were at the threshold. Not blocking exactly, but present in the way that made the mathematics of entry feel like a statement. Simon looked at them. 6 pairs of amber eyes looked back with 6 different varieties of unimpressed. Pen was sitting directly in the center of the doorway. Simon looked at Pen. Pen looked at Simon with the expression of a border official who had reviewed the credentials and found them underwhelming. "Pen," Hetta said. "Let him through." Pen moved, slowly, in the specific way of someone making a point through the medium of movement. Simon came in. Beatrix was at the table with her tea, and she looked at Simon with the expression she'd been saving for this moment. Not hostile, not warm, simply the honest face of a woman who had witnessed 40 years of things and had very strong opinions about all of them that she was currently choosing not to voice. "Beatrix," Simon said, with the careful tone of a man acknowledging a person he'd underestimated and had now come to understand he shouldn't have. "Simon," Beatrix said. She did not offer tea. They sat at the long table, Hetta across from him, the way she'd sat across from Corvin, except that Corvin had come with something approaching honesty, and Simon had come with something more complicated still. The vigilantes arranged themselves. Taryn beside Hetta, Grev at distance, watching, Vina at the window, Lorne near the backroom door with his ancient deep eyes on Simon, reading him the way Lorne read everything. Slowly, completely, without judgment, but without illusion either. Simon looked at the carved walls, at the amber warmth of the room, at the land records spread across the table. His eyes moved the way they always moved in unfamiliar situations, assessing, cataloging, looking for the structure he could use. He wasn't going to find one. The Hearthstone didn't have a structure he could use. "The eastern fields," he started, "are recovering," she said. "They'll yield by late spring." He looked at her. "How?" "The Voss gift," she said simply, "which is mine, which does not transfer on a document." She kept her voice entirely without heat. "Which you never actually had, regardless of what the accord stated." A pause. She watched him process this, the specific sequence of a proud man encountering a structural error in his own understanding of his position. "The covenant," he started. "Transferred the authority," she said. "Not the connection. The land knows blood, Simon. It knows presence. It knows who has been here, who has put hands in the earth, who has chosen to stay." She looked at him steadily. "You were never here. You were managing the idea of here from a throne built on my family's foundation. And the land endured it for 40 years because I was also here, doing the actual work. When I left, the land noticed." He was quiet. This was unusual. Simon in silence was something she'd rarely seen, and only under conditions of significant recalculation. "What do you want?" he said. And for the first time she heard something beneath the formal register. Not regret, exactly. Not quite. But something adjacent to it. The thing that lives just outside regret in people who've spent too long in the habit of not examining themselves. Hetta looked at him for a long moment. "I want what I already have," she said. "This land, this house, the work I'm doing from here, on my terms." She paused. "I want the record corrected, formally. The Voss Accord documented accurately, what the covenant actually requires, what the gift is, where it lives." She held his gaze. "And I want it acknowledged, in whatever formal language your court uses, that the territory's recovery is a function of Voss blood and Voss presence. Not royal authority, not a king's decision. Mine." The fire crackled. Penn, who had settled near the hearth, shifted position with the deliberate minimum of movement. Simon looked at the table, at his hands, at the room around him. "Serana," he said. Hetta waited. The bond is genuine," he said, and she heard very clearly that he was not asking her to care about this. He was simply being accurate, perhaps for the first time in a while. "I did not. What happened in the hall was not." He stopped, started again with the specific difficulty of a man who has not had enough practice telling the truth and is finding the words awkward. "You deserved more than that morning." It was not a full apology. It did not account for 40 years or the ways that the end of something poisons the memory of its beginning. It was a man saying a partial true thing, which was more than she'd expected. "Yes," she said simply. "I did." He nodded. "Once." "The records," he said. "I'll have them amended." "Corvin will oversee it," she said. "I trust his accuracy." Something moved in Simon's face at his son's name. Something she couldn't fully read, but that looked like a man finding out his eldest had made choices he wasn't fully aware of. "Corvin has been here," Simon said. "Corvin came to find me," she said. "On his own, without being sent." The pause that followed was its own kind of information. "He's more like you than I realized," Simon said quietly. And she understood, in the way she'd always understood things he hadn't quite said, that this was not criticism. "He always was," she said. Simon left an hour later, with 4 guards and a white horse, and the specific quality of silence that belongs to someone who arrived expecting a negotiation and left having had something else entirely. Hetta stood at the door and watched him go. Beatrix came to stand beside her. "Well," Beatrix said. "Well," Hetta agreed. "He came expecting to manage you. He did. And you were completely unmanageable. I was perfectly reasonable," Hetta said. "I simply wasn't available." Beatrix considered this. "There's a version of this," she said carefully, "where that's the same thing." "There is," Hetta agreed, and allowed it. Penn appeared between them at the doorway, watched the direction Simon had ridden for a moment with the specific expression of a creature filing a verdict, and then turned and walked back inside with his verdict filed. "Grev didn't move closer," Beatrix observed. "No," Hetta said. "He didn't. The vigilantes knew what they knew. And what they knew, Hetta had learned, was usually accurate." She went back inside, and the Hearthstone closed its warmth around her, and the land outside breathed on in its long, steady recovery. And she picked up the records and continued the work that was hers, and had always been hers, in the house that knew her name. Calder came back on a Tuesday. Beatrix, who had developed strong opinions about the significance of Tuesdays since the dissolution ceremony, noted this with the expression of a woman updating a personal theory. He arrived the way he'd arrived the first time, without announcement, without the performed quality of someone making an entrance, except that this time he wasn't lost. He came through the northern tree line on the same horse, with the same unhurried pace, and this time he carried a wooden crate strapped to the saddle that turned out to contain, when opened on the Hearthstone's kitchen table, 3 jars of preserved winter plum, a block of aged hard cheese, a bundle of dried northern herbs that Hetta had mentioned once in passing she'd been unable to find at the way station, and a folded paper with hand-drawn notes on the soil conditions along the northern boundary that she'd asked about 3 weeks ago, and had not followed up on because she hadn't wanted to presume. He had remembered. He had gone out in the cold and done the work, and written it down, and brought it to her without being asked twice. Hetta looked at the crate. She looked at the notes. She looked at Calder, who was standing at the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man who had considered whether this was too much, and had decided it was just enough, and hoped he'd read that correctly. "Thank you," she said. "The plum preserves are from my grandmother's recipe," he said. "She put rosemary in, which sounds wrong but isn't." "I'll take that on faith," she said. "It's earned," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, and she found herself doing the same. From the doorway behind Calder, Beatrix appeared, looked at the crate, looked at the 2 of them, and said with magnificent restraint, "I'll make tea," and went back to the kitchen without further comment, which was, Hetta knew, the loudest possible version of a comment. They worked through the boundary notes at the long table, Calder explaining the soil conditions he'd found in the northwestern corner where the Voss land met his own. Hetta cross-referencing with the cedar records and the understanding she'd built over weeks of working the connection from the back room. The vigilantes arranged themselves as they always did. Taryn near Hetta, Sorrel near Warmth, Vina at the window. Penn had immediately investigated the crate when it was opened, determined there was nothing further to investigate, and relocated to Calder's left boot with the proprietary air of a creature establishing a claim. Calder looked down at Penn periodically throughout the conversation. He had, Hetta noticed, stopped looking surprised by Penn, and started looking at him with the affectionate exasperation of someone who has accepted a new condition of their existence. Grev was different today. He had moved, sometime in the first half hour, from his usual position of considered distance to a spot beside Calder's chair, not pressed against him, not demanding anything, simply beside. And when Calder reached down, at a natural pause in the conversation, and rested his hand on Grev's back with the easy unconsciousness of someone who had stopped thinking about whether it was allowed, Grev's glow shifted to something deeper and warmer. Hetta kept her eyes on the records, but she felt it. "The northwestern corner is interesting," Calder said, leaning over the notes with the focused quality he brought to things he was actually thinking about rather than performing. "The soil there is different from the rest of the boundary line. Older, somehow. Denser." He looked at her. Feels like it's been waiting for something. It probably has, Hetta said. That corner is original Voss land, before the family moved south and consolidated, the oldest part of the connection. She traced the boundary on the cedar map with one finger. It's the root of the system. Once that comes back fully, the rest will follow faster. Can you work on it from here? He asked. I've been getting closer, she said. Each session goes further than the last. She paused. The northwestern corner is the last piece I haven't been able to fully reach yet. Calder looked at the map, then at her, with the directness she'd come to recognize as simply how he was, not performing it, not using it for effect, just the natural manner of someone who had gotten past the age of saying things sideways. My land borders it, he said. I've been here long enough that the earth knows my name, for whatever that's worth. He paused, measuring his next words with the same care he'd shown from the beginning, offering, not pressing. If it would help to work from that side of the boundary, I could, he gestured, a simple open-handed movement. Be there. If presence is what's needed. If that would be useful. The kitchen was quiet. From somewhere beyond the doorway, Beatrix had gone very still in a way that meant she was listening intently and pretending not to. Hetta looked at Calder. At the easy, unhurried way he sat in this room that was hers, that the Hearthstone had opened for her and nobody else, where the vigilantes had brought him in and kept him, and where Grev, careful, reserved, twice-burned Grev, was now glowing warmly against his hand. It would be useful, she said. Then I'll be there, he said. Simply, the way he said most things. Beatrix came out of the kitchen with tea, set it on the table, and said, without looking at either of them, Rosemary and plum preserves actually sounds lovely. I'm making a note of that. Penn sneezed. Thank you, Penn, said Beatrix. He didn't leave that evening when the light thinned. Not because she asked him to stay. She didn't, and he didn't presume. But because the conversation had that quality that some conversations have of being genuinely in the middle of itself, when the practical world suggested it should have been finished, and they both recognized it, and neither of them manufactured an ending. They ate dinner, Beatrix's doing, with the rosemary plum preserve opened and pronounced excellent, which Beatrix announced as if she were granting an award, and talked about the kinds of things that people talk about when they've gotten past the careful surface things and are finding out what's underneath. He had been married for 31 years, he said. She had been a woman of considerable opinions and occasional volcanic energy, and he had loved her entirely and missed her in the way you miss things that were simply part of the structure of your days. He didn't make it a wound he was carrying, just something that was true. Hetta told him about the back room, and the walls, and the line of Voss women in the stone. Not all of it. There were parts of it still settling into her own understanding. Parts she was still turning over. But enough. He listened with the full, quiet attention he gave everything, and asked 2 questions, both of which were the right questions. Lorne crossed the room at some point in the middle of the evening and sat at Calder's feet. Just sat there, with his ancient silver eyes and his deep, steady glow. He had not done this for Corvin. He had not done this for the emissary. He had not done this, in fact, for anyone except Hetta herself and Beatrix. In 3 weeks of people coming to the Hearthstone's door. Calder looked down at Lorne. He looked at Hetta. The old one, he said. The oldest, she confirmed. He decides slowly. He means it when he decides. Calder held her gaze for a moment, and she felt, in the specific way that things are felt when you're 63 and have stopped pretending you don't notice them, the warmth of being looked at by someone who was looking at her, not the queen, not the useful bloodline, not the woman who had been made small for so long that small had started to feel like her actual dimensions. Just her, Hetta, sitting at her own table, in her own house, with her hands warm from a day's good work, and 6 vigilantes glowing amber around her and 40 years of accumulated clarity about what actually mattered. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Penn, who had been sleeping against Calder's boot, chose this exact moment to kick in his sleep and fall off the boot entirely, landing on the floor with a thud and waking himself up. He looked around with complete disorientation. Penn, Beatrix said from across the table, without looking up from her tea. Penn blinked. The moment broke cleanly and with humor, which was, Hetta thought, exactly the right way for it to break. Calder laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, low and unhurried. She found herself laughing too, and it felt like something that had been folded up for a long time being opened out to its full size. That one, Calder said, looking at Pen, is absolutely going to be the death of someone's composure. He already has been, Hetta said. Repeatedly. We've accepted it as a feature. Pen stood up, reclaimed his position at the boot with immense dignity, and closed his eyes. Calder left when the moon was high, with Lorne watching him to the tree line and staying there after he'd gone. A thing Lorne had never done before. Hetta stood at the door. The night air was cold and clear, and smelled of pine resin and the particular winter scent of land that was resting but not gone. Her hands were warm. The amber ring was warm on her finger, and somewhere in her chest, in the place that had been carefully managed and correctly defended, and very quietly, very privately lonely for a long time, something was uncurling, not urgently, not dramatically, just with the slow, unhurried confidence of things that are growing in the right conditions, opening. Beatrix appeared at her shoulder with 2 cups of tea and handed her one. They stood in the doorway together. Well, Beatrix said. Don't, Hetta said. I'm not saying anything. You're about to. I'm merely observing, Beatrix said, that Lorne is still at the tree line, and Lorne has not, in my observation, been wrong yet. She drank her tea. That's all. Merely an observation. I'm going to bed. She went inside. Hetta stood in the doorway a moment longer, with the cold and the moonlight and Lorne's steady amber glow at the tree line and the hearthstone warm at her back. 63, she thought, and still capable of surprise. She went inside, and the door closed, and the land breathed on around her in the long, patient rhythm of things that are waiting, with complete confidence, for spring. Spring came to the Northern Territory, the way spring comes to land that has been genuinely waiting for it, not gradually, not politely, but all at once, with the specific abundance of something that has been holding itself back for too long and has finally, completely, let go. It started in the northwestern corner. Hetta was there when it happened. She had been working the boundary for 3 weeks, each session going deeper than the last, with Calder on the other side of the line, hands flat on his own earth, presence steady and unhurried, the land on his side recognizing his decades of belonging and accepting it as anchor, the way land accepts things that are simply true. She had felt the connection building incrementally, the way you feel a sentence being completed one word at a time, until one morning in late March, she pressed both palms into the northwestern soil and felt the last resistance dissolve, not dramatically, just gone. The way a knot releases when you've worked it long enough from exactly the right angle. The warmth that moved through her was nothing like the hollow, consuming pull she'd spent 40 years managing from a borrowed position. This was circular. This was the gift cycling as it was always supposed to. Outward into the land, and back through the root of belonging, and out again and back. A living system with no leak, no drain, no slow hemorrhage of a woman giving everything to a covenant that was never properly hers. She opened her eyes. The northwestern corner was green. Not pale or tentative, actually, deeply, extravagantly green. The kind of green that announces something has made a decision. Across the boundary line, Calder was already standing, looking at it. He looked at her. His expression was the one he had, the unhurried, direct one, but with something behind it that was more open than usual. "That's it," she said. "That's it," he agreed. She stood up. Her knees protested, which she acknowledged and ignored. She walked to the boundary line and stood at it, the invisible seam between Voss land and Mour land, and looked at the green spreading outward in both directions, and felt the territory breathe, all of it, the eastern valley and the southern orchards and the high ridge fields and the river margins, all of it, finding its direction again like a compass settling north. All of it, hers, not by document, not by marriage, not by the grace of a king who'd never understood what he was standing on. by blood, by presence, by 40 years of work that had finally, on its own terms, been allowed to complete itself. She felt Terran at her ankle before she heard him, his warmth against her boot, his steady amber glow. She looked down. All 6 vigilantes had come. She hadn't heard them cross the field. They were simply there, arranged around her in the loose arc they made when something mattered, their glow stronger than she'd ever seen it. Not urgent, not alarmed. Just full. The way a light is full when it's finally been given enough room. Lorne was looking at the green. He made the low chiming sound. Just once. The way he made it when something was finished and the finishing was good. The letter from Simon arrived a week later. Not an emissary this time. His own hand, his own seal. 3 pages in the formal court script he'd used for every official document of his reign. She read it at the long table with Beatrix beside her and Sorrel against her arm, and Pen asleep on a cushion nearby with the satisfied posture of a creature whose world was in order. The letter was precise and complete. It acknowledged in formal language that had clearly been written and rewritten until the words did what they needed to do without the king having to feel too much while writing them, that the Northern Territory's recovery was a function of Voss bloodline connection and presence, not royal authority. It documented the true nature of the Voss Accord, what the covenant required, where the gift lived, why the transfer of title had been structurally insufficient without the bloodline's willing participation. It confirmed that these facts had been entered into the official court records under Corvin's oversight. At the bottom, in handwriting that was slightly less formal than the rest, slightly more like someone actually writing rather than a king composing, 3 sentences. You were right about the land. You were right about most things. I am sorry it took me this long to say so in a form that meant something. Hetta read those 3 sentences twice. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the cedar chest with the Voss records, because it was part of the history and history deserved to be kept accurately, the good and the insufficient and everything in between. Well, Beatrix said. Well, Hetta agreed. Was it enough? Hetta thought about this honestly. No, she said. But it was true. And he meant it. She looked at the cedar chest. That counts for something. Not everything. Something. Beatrix nodded and didn't push it further because she understood the difference between resolution and absolution, and she knew which one Hetta needed and which one she didn't. Corvin came in the 2nd week of April, when the orchards were in full blossom, and the valley below the Hearthstone had turned the particular pale gold of early grain. He came with Mira and Rendell, which Hetta had not known to expect, and she stood at the Hearthstone's door and looked at the 3 of them in the clearing, and felt the complicated weight of 30 years of imperfect, genuine love that had no clean name and didn't need one. Mira, who had not met Hetta's eyes in the hall, met them now. She was 31, with her mother's dark hair and something in her face that had been resolving itself, from what Hetta could see, into a clearer version of who she actually was. She stood at the clearing's edge for a moment, and then she crossed it without ceremony and put her arms around Hetta in the specific, wholehearted way of someone who has decided to stop managing themselves. Hetta held her. She didn't say it's all right because some things are not all right and shouldn't be called so. She just held her, and Mira held her back, and Sorrel came and pressed her warm weight against both their legs, and that was sufficient. Rendell was last. He was 28, the youngest, the one who'd been looking at his boots in the hall while his father dissolved 40 years of marriage, who had said to Corvin afterward the truest thing anyone had said about the whole affair, who had sent nothing and come nowhere in the weeks since. He stood at the edge of the clearing now with his hands in his pockets, and his face doing the complicated work of someone who has rehearsed a thing many times, and is now finding out that rehearsed things don't quite fit the actual moment. Hetta walked to him. She stopped 2 feet away and looked at him. This boy she had loved from the age of 3 months, this man he'd become, and waited. I should have said something, he said. In the hall, I knew it was wrong. I've known for... He stopped. I've known for a long time that it was wrong, and I kept choosing the easier thing, and I don't know how to... He stopped again. His jaw worked. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. It's not nothing, Hetta said, and it's true. which is more than a lot of apologies manage. He looked at her. Something in his face was very young for a moment. The way people's faces go young when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time and have finally put it down. The fields came back, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on it. I was in the Eastern Valley when it happened. I felt it. I don't know how to explain it. I just felt it. Like something went warm all at once, and I knew it was you. He looked at the Hearthstone, at its moss-covered roof and amber windows. I knew you'd done it, and I sat down in the middle of the field and I cried for about 20 minutes, which is... He shook his head. I'm not telling you that for... I don't know why I'm telling you that. Because it's true, Hetta said. And we've done enough of the other kind. She opened her arms. He came into them with the graceless, genuine relief of someone who had been waiting for permission they didn't know they needed. And she held her youngest the way she'd held all three of them through everything. Without condition, without ledger, with the specific love that had always been its own kind of absolute, regardless of blood or document, or the opinions of anyone else. Penn appeared at Rendell's feet, sniffed him with thorough professionalism, and sat down. He approves, Beatrix said from behind Hetta, with the brisk certainty of a woman announcing a verdict. Rendell looked down at the small glowing wolf. Penn looked back. Does he always just... Rendell started. Yes, said everyone present simultaneously. The recognition came not through any official announcement, but through the way truth moves in territories where people work the land and pay attention. It spread from the farmers in the Eastern Valley to the orchard keepers, to the ridge shepherds to the market towns, carried by people who had put their hands in the spring soil and felt what was different about it, who had watched their harvests return and understood, in the wordless way of people who live close to the earth, that something had come back that hadn't been there for years. It's the Voss woman, they said, the one who left. She came back to the old land and she brought the fields back with her. No one had told them to say it. No court decree had instructed it. It was simply what was true. And true things have a way of being found eventually by people who need them. Brenna, the territory's elder, came to the Hearthstone in the third week of April with a delegation of 6 people from different parts of the territory. Farmers, keepers, a healer, an old woman from the ridge villages who had been born on land her family had farmed for 5 generations. They came with the specific, unceremonious directness of people who have something important to say and are not going to dress it in court language. They stood in the clearing, and the elder spoke for them. The land came back, she said. We know why. We wanted to come and say so. To your face. Not in a document. She looked at Hetta steadily. The Northern Territory knows your name. It's always known your name. We should have said so long before this. Hetta stood at the threshold of the Hearthstone with all 6 vigilantes arranged at her feet, and the amber ring warm on her finger, and the spring light coming through the trees in long horizontal shafts. And she received this with the composure of a woman who had needed it for 40 years and had stopped needing it in order to deserve it. Thank you, she said. Simply, completely. The old woman from the ridge, she must have been 80 if she was a day, with the face of someone who had survived things without being made smaller by them, came forward and pressed Hetta's hands between her own. Stay, she said. We're better with you here. That evening, when the delegation had gone and the 3 children were in the process of making themselves at home in the Hearthstone, with the specific ease of people finding out that a place feels like it was waiting for them, and Beatrix was in the kitchen engaged in a private conversation with Penn that had been going on for 40 minutes, and which Hetta had decided to leave undisturbed. That evening, Calder came. He came the way he always came, through the northern trees, on the same horse, without announcement. He came into the clearing and found Hetta sitting on the stone bench at the Hearthstone's east wall that caught the last of the evening light, with Lorne at her feet and Taryn against her side, and the amber ring turning in her fingers the way it had been turning since the hall. He sat down beside her without asking, because he'd learned the distinction between presuming and simply being present, and he knew which one she'd welcome. They sat for a while without speaking, which was the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. The Northwest is holding, he said eventually. It is, she said. Strongly. It'll hold through winter, he said. I've felt soil like that before. Once it commits, it commits. She looked at him. At the sight of his face in the evening light, the gray at his temples, the lines of decades well lived, the particular quality of stillness he had that was not the stillness of a man managing himself, but the stillness of a man who had genuinely arrived at a place inside himself and stayed there. Calder, she said. He turned. She had been thinking for 3 weeks about how to say what she wanted to say without saying too much or too little or in the wrong register for two people their age who had both already had their lives restructured around them and knew the difference between beginning something and performing something. She decided to simply say it. I don't know what this is exactly, she said. I know I'm 63 and you're 65, and I know we've both had full lives that didn't involve each other. I know I'm not looking for what I had before. I'm not sure I ever want another covenant or arrangement or anything that lives in official language. She held his gaze. But I know that when you come through those trees, something in me is glad. And I know that Lorne sat at your feet. And Lorne does not do that without reason. And I've learned to trust his reasons. She paused. And I know that I would like to keep knowing you. In whatever form that takes. Properly. Calder looked at her for a moment, the full, unhurried look he gave things that mattered. I came back every week, he said, because I wanted to. Not because the boundary needed checking or because I had cheese to deliver, though I did have cheese to deliver. The corner of his mouth moved. I came back because you're the most interesting person I've been in a room with in years. Because you talk to land like it's worth listening to, and you're right. And I've been saying that to people for 30 years, and most of them think I'm eccentric. He looked at the Hearthstone. I came back because this place feels like something I didn't know I was looking for, and because Penn has decided he owns my left boot, and I've accepted that as a permanent condition, which means I've already committed to a certain level of involvement with this household. Hetta laughed. Fully, cleanly, the way she'd been laughing more in the past weeks than she had in decades. Properly, he said, returning to her word. Yes, I'd like that. He reached out and took her hand, not the amber ring hand, the other one, and held it in the easy, certain way of someone who has already spent time making sure this is offered, rather than taken. His hand was warm. The evening was cold. The Hearthstone's amber light fell across the bench and across both of them. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. That was, she found, entirely sufficient. Later, when the evening had gone properly dark, and the Hearthstone was full of the specific warm noise of people who belong in a place, Corvin and Mira arguing good-naturedly over the Cedar records, Rendall discovering that Penn had stolen something of his, and responding to this with the resigned laughter of a man who had made peace with the situation faster than expected, Calder at the table with tea and a conversation with Beatrix that had been going for 20 minutes and showed no signs of stopping. Beatrix stepped outside. Penn followed her. He always followed her. She stood at the edge of the clearing in the dark, with the moon coming through the pines and Penn at her feet, and she looked up at the sky for a long moment with the expression she wore when she was feeling something she hadn't scheduled. Penn sat beside her left boot. Not the right one. The right one had the lace he'd compromised. The left one was still respectable. He was choosing to honor that distinction tonight. Penn? Beatrix said. Penn looked up. I want to tell you something, she said, in the quieter voice she used when she wasn't performing the commentary. And I'm telling you because you'll keep it, which is something I appreciate about you. She looked down at him. 62 years old. Never thought I'd be standing in a glowing forest with a supernatural wolf who has opinions about bootlaces, feeling like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. She paused. It's ridiculous. Penn blinked. I know, she said. I know. She crouched down, carefully, the way 62-year-old knees require, and put her hand on Penn's back, and Penn's glow brightened in the specific way it did when he was feeling something he didn't have words for, but didn't want to reduce. Good Tuesday, Beatrix said. Penn sneezed softly and pressed against her hand. Best Tuesday, she corrected. She found Hetta inside an hour later, sitting at the long table with the amber ring in her palm, turning it the way she always turned it when she was thinking. The room was quieter now. Corvin had taken the others to the rooms that the Hearthstone had, in its particular way, simply seemed to have available, as if it had been expecting company of exactly this number. Calder had gone home through the northern trees with the promise of tomorrow, which felt like something she intended to keep. Beatrix sat across from her. "The ring," she said. Hetta looked at it. Her mother's ring. Her mother's mother's ring. Old gold. Amber stone. The warmth of a line of women who had each found their way back to something after being turned away from somewhere they thought was theirs. "I've been deciding what to do with it," Hetta said. "For weeks." "And?" She looked at the ring for a long moment. She thought about the haul, the careful way she'd slid it off her finger and placed it on the chair arm, the deliberate choice of it. She had not left it behind. She had taken it with her. She had always known, somewhere underneath the composure, that she wasn't leaving it there. She put it back on her finger, not the left hand, where it had lived for 40 years as part of an arrangement that was finished. The right hand, her own hand, the hand that had pressed into the earth of the Hearthstone's clearing and felt the land recognize her and come home. She looked at it there. It fit exactly as it always had, which was perhaps the point. "It stays with the blood," she said, "with whoever needs reminding next time." She looked at Beatrix. "When someone is ready for it." Beatrix looked at the ring, looked at Hetta's face, looked at the carved walls of the Hearthstone glowing faintly with amber light, the old symbols that had held the memory of 100 years of women finding their way back. "And the house?" Beatrix said. Hetta looked around the room. The cedar records on the table, the fire she'd been keeping since she arrived, the 6 vigilantes arranged in their constellation of quiet, faithful presences, the warmth of a place that had known her name when nothing else did. "The Hearthstone is ours," she said. "Mine and yours. Whoever belongs here will know it, the way we knew it." She looked at Taryn, who was watching her with his steady amber eyes. "And the vigilantes stay. They've always stayed. That's what they do." Lorne, from his place by the fire, opened one eye. He looked at Hetta. Then he closed it again, with the finality of something confirming what was already true. All 6 of them glowed steadily in the dark. Taryn and Vina and Sorrel and Grev and Lorne and Penn, 6 small lights in the old stone room, warming the carved walls and the cedar records, and the amber ring on a woman's right hand, and the 2 cups of tea that Beatrix was already making. Because it was evening, and tea was what you made in the evening in a house that was yours. Outside, the Northern Territory breathed in the long, abundant rhythm of land that has been given back to itself. The orchards were thick with blossom. The Eastern Valley had shoots in every field. The northwestern corner, the oldest root of the oldest connection, was so thoroughly, stubbornly alive that the farmers who walked through it in the mornings had started leaving small stones at the boundary as a mark of something they couldn't fully articulate but felt clearly. It wasn't gratitude, exactly. It was recognition. The kind that happens when something returns to what it was always supposed to be, and the world notices and decides to mark the fact. Hetta Voss had walked out of a hall 63 years into her life, with nothing but an amber ring and the accumulated composure of a woman who had survived things that should have broken her. She had taken the northern road. She had followed a hand-drawn map to a house that knew her name. She had pressed her hands into the earth of a land that had been waiting for her and felt it press back. She had come home, not to what she'd lost, not to what she'd been promised, not to any version of the life that had been built around her without her as its center. To this. To the Hearthstone's amber warmth and the sound of her family in the rooms above, and 6 vigilantes keeping faithful watch, and the right-hand ring and the spring outside the windows, and the man who came through the northern trees because he wanted to. To land that knew her name and said so. To a life that was, finally and completely and without apology, hers. That, she thought, setting down her cup and looking at the fire and feeling the deep settled warmth of everything that was exactly where it was supposed to be, was not the first honest thing that had happened to her. It was the culmination of all of them. It was home, and she was never leaving it again. The end. If this story found you, The morning Hetta walked out of that hall, the first night in the Hearthstone, the moment the fields came back, leave a comment telling me which scene you'll carry with you. And if you're someone who knows what it feels like to put yourself down for so long you forget your own name, this story was for you. Hetta got here. So can you.